Hey guys. Alright, so it's been a while. Almost 6 months actually since I uploaded my last video. The last time you guys saw this tank, I had just finished transferring everything out of the failing Red Sea tank and into this new replacement tank. And thankfully that transfer went about as well as I could have hoped for. The corals did settle in, the tank stabilized, and since then it's mostly been on cruise control. But while the tank was doing well, life got pretty busy. And I mean really busy. And over the last 3 months, I started letting things slide in a way that just isn't like me, especially after more than 20 years in the hobby. I stopped keeping up with some of the most basic maintenance tasks. Some were cosmetic, some were careless, and a couple of them could have become serious if I didn't have the right monitoring and automation in place. But somehow, through all of that neglect, I did learn something unexpected about this tank. One of the maintenance tasks I stopped doing may have actually been holding the tank back. Because after I stopped doing it, the corals oddly enough began looking better than ever. So in this video, I'm going to show you the 5 biggest things that I neglected, how my equipment helped cover my butt when life got busy, and the one part of my maintenance routine that I might be eliminating completely. So let's start with the most obvious sign that I wasn't keeping up with the tank anymore. The first thing I started neglecting was probably the least serious, but it was also the most visible, and that's cleaning the glass. Normally, I like to clean the glass about twice a week. I'm pretty obsessive about it. Even the slightest film on the glass bothers me because it takes away from the clarity of the tank, and in my opinion, it makes everything look less polished. But over the last few months, I started letting it go for an entire week before cleaning it. And for me, that's a long time. It's not that the glass became completely covered in algae, but there was definitely more buildup than I would normally tolerate. I would walk past a tank, notice it, and tell myself, I'll get to it later. And then several more days would go by, and I wouldn't get to it. Compared to everything else in this video, this is mostly cosmetic. It wasn't hurting the corals, and it certainly wasn't putting the tank in any kind of danger. But it was one of those first signs that my normal routine was starting to slip. And interestingly, the algae was growing a little faster on the glass during this period. It's funny because sometimes the difference between a tank looking average and incredible is just 5 minutes with an algae scraper or an algae magnet. But dirty glass was nothing compared to the next thing I kept forgetting. The second thing I neglected was refilling my ATO reservoir. This happened to me more than once. My Proflux controller would notify me that the reservoir was empty, so I knew it needed to be refilled. The system in the end did exactly what it was supposed to do. It gave me the warning. But I would see the notification either on this tablet or on my phone while I was busy doing something else. I would tell myself, I'll take care of it later, and then of course I would completely forget about it. Well, eventually the reminder came directly from the tank because the return pump would start blowing air bubbles into the display. At that point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to stop what I was doing, refill the reservoir, and manually top off the system. Thankfully, it never got to the point where the return section ran completely dry or the pump was damaged. But it did show me how easy it is to become dependent on a notification while still failing to act on it. The automation did in fact give me extra time, but it couldn't manually refill the reservoir for me. That's something important to understand about aquarium automation. An alert is only useful when you actually respond to it. The equipment can warn you, it can protect the system and even buy you some time, but there are still certain things that require a human being to get up and actually do the work. And while the display tank was still looking good, things underneath the tank were becoming much less impressive. The third area I neglected was basic sump maintenance. This included emptying the skimmer cup, changing out the filter floss, and changing out the phosphate media in this media reactor. These are all simple tasks. None of them are particularly difficult, and none of them take very long to do, but I just wasn't doing them consistently. For example, this skimmer cup, it's been about 2.5 months since I emptied the cup and cleaned it. Normally, I would clean this out every single week, regardless of how much skimmate was in the cup. And in this case, because I was busy, I didn't get around to it. Fast forward 2.5 months later, this is how much skimming I've collected. Yeah, it's not that much. But the problem is there's so much gunk buildup in the neck of the skimmer cup that it does not allow the protein skimmer to work effectively. I kept looking at the skimmer cup, and just like the ATO reservoir, I kept telling myself, yeah, I'll get to it later. And you know how that worked out. I never got to it. So this is actually something I'm going to do today. And the same thing happened with my filter floss. It would become really dark and dirty, and instead of changing it immediately, I would let it just sit longer than I should have. And then there was the phosphate media. I also failed to replace the media inside my reactor as often as I normally would. Once that media becomes exhausted, it isn't doing much anymore. The reactor may still be running and water may still be flowing through it, but that doesn't mean the media inside is continuing to remove phosphate effectively. This whole section of the tank became a perfect example of equipment running in the background and just creating the illusion that everything was being handled, even though the maintenance behind that equipment was being neglected. So the first three things were not ideal, but the fourth one did have potential to become genuinely dangerous for the corals. The fourth thing I neglected was keeping my alkalinity container filled. This was easily one of the more serious mistakes because this tank consumes a huge amount of alkalinity every day. Right now, the system consumes about 1.5 DKH every day, and I dose around 240 mils of alkalinity supplement every single day. The alkalinity container itself holds about 1 gallon of solution, which means it only lasts me around 18 days before it needs to be refilled. 18 days comes around pretty quick, and during this period, there were multiple times when I allowed that container to get dangerously low. At least in one case, I let it run empty long enough for the alkalinity level in the aquarium to start dropping. Thankfully, the GHL KH director tests my alkalinity every day. It detected that the KH was falling and alerted me before the situation became much worse. So without that daily testing, I might not have noticed that problem until coral started showing visible signs of stress. And with a tank that consumes 1.5 DKH every day, that's not something I can ignore for very long. A tank with low alkalinity consumption might have a little more breathing room, but this tank does not. Once dosing stops, the alkalinity can decline pretty quickly. This is where automation genuinely covered my butt. The KH director didn't refill the container for me, and it didn't correct the underlying problem, but it did show me exactly what was happening before that mistake turned into coral loss. That's the value of monitoring, and it doesn't make aquarium maintenance free, but it does give you visibility into the system when your attention is somewhere else. I obviously know better than to let an alkalinity container run empty. So this wasn't a matter of lack of knowledge. It was simply life getting busy and me failing to stay ahead of a predictable maintenance task. And honestly, that might be the most relatable lesson here. Experience doesn't make you immune to mistakes. Going forward, I may need to either use a larger alkalinity reservoir or create a more aggressive alert that gives me several days of advance notice instead of waiting until the container is nearly empty. But the final thing I neglected turned out very differently from everything else on this list. The fifth thing I neglected was my water change routine. Before all of this, I had an automatic water change system set up. I was changing about 2 to 3 gallons of water every day, 5 days out of the week. The system itself was automated, but I still had to make the salt water, refill the water change reservoir, and keep everything ready for the system to operate. Once life became busier, I stopped refilling this reservoir. And once the reservoir was empty, the automatic water changes just stopped. At first, I viewed this as just another task that I had failed to keep up with. I kept telling myself I would mix another batch of salt water, refill the reservoir, and just restart the schedule. But the weeks kept passing, one after the other. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of corals becoming dull, stressed, and unhealthy, they actually started to look better. The colors appeared stronger, the growth continued, and overall the tank remained stable. The corals seemed happier than they had been while I was performing the frequent automatic water changes. Now, I want to be careful with how I explain this part. I definitely can't prove that stopping the water changes caused the corals themselves to improve. There are multiple things happening inside a reef aquarium at any given time, and correlation does not automatically mean causation. What I can say is that the tank did not suffer when the water changes stopped, and after several months without that routine, the tank looked better than it had before. That was enough to make me question whether changing 2 or 3 gallons almost every day was actually providing a meaningful benefit, or whether I was simply doing it because frequent water changes are generally considered good aquarium maintenance. It's possible that the tank benefited from greater stability. It's possible that I was removing or diluting something the corals were using. It's also possible that nutrients settled into a range that the corals preferred. Or it could simply be that the aquarium was continuing to mature after the tank transfer. I honestly don't have enough evidence yet to say exactly why the tank improved, but I do have enough evidence to reconsider the whole routine. So, after seeing how the tank responded, I don't currently plan to restart the automatic water change schedule. Instead of changing 2 to 3 gallons 5 days per week, I'm considering performing one larger water change of approximately 20 to 30 gallons every 2 or 3 months. The purpose of those larger water changes would not necessarily be to correct the problem with the water chemistry. Instead, it would give me an opportunity to vacuum the sand bed, remove detritus trapped between the grains, and give the system that extra polished appearance. I still believe that water changes are a useful tool, and I'm not saying that reef tanks never need them. And I'm definitely not telling everyone to stop doing their water changes. What I am saying is that every aquarium is different, and sometimes we continue doing something simply because it has always been a part of our routine. Accidentally stopping my water changes forced me to step back and evaluate what the tank was actually telling me. And right now, the tank is telling me that frequent water changes may not be necessary for this particular system. So looking back at the last 3 months, I'm not proud of everything that I neglected. I let the glass become dirtier than I normally would. I forgot to refill the ATO reservoir. I neglected the skimmer cup, filter floss, and my media reactor. And I came dangerously close to allowing the alkalinity to fall much further than it should have. But this experience also reminded me why I invested in monitoring and automation in the first place. Automation should never be used as an excuse to ignore an aquarium. It doesn't eliminate maintenance, and it doesn't replace the aquarist. But when life becomes busy, the right equipment can warn you, protect the system, and give you that extra amount of time before a small mistake turns into a disaster. Even after more than 2 decades in this hobby, I'm still learning from this tank, and sometimes the lessons come from the things that I did wrong. There's also a reason life has become so busy lately, and much of it is connected to the aquarium world. I'm not ready to get into all of that in this video, but I will be sharing more with you guys about what I've been working on very soon. For now, I'm just happy to be back, happy that the tank survived my temporary lapse in maintenance, and extremely happy with how the corals are looking. Let me know in the comments section whether you perform regular water changes, automatic water changes, or whether you only change water when the tank gives you a reason to. As always, guys, thank you for watching.